There are nights in television that disappear the moment the cameras stop rolling. Then there are nights people swear they remember for the rest of their lives. This is one of those stories. Whether you're sitting in the front row beneath bright studio lights or watching quietly from your living room with a cup of coffee, every once in a while a conversation becomes something much bigger than entertainment. It becomes human. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let me take you back. It's Monday evening, November 3rd, 1980. NBC Studios in Burbank is running exactly the way you'd expect. The audience has already settled into their seats. The orchestra has finished warming up. Backstage, producers are checking cue cards one last time. Assistants are racing through hallways carrying folders. And somewhere a makeup artist is reminding a guest that television lights are never as forgiving as they look. Just another night at the Tonight Show. From where I'm sitting behind the desk, everything feels comfortably familiar. After enough years in late-night television, you learn to recognize the rhythm of a good show before the first guest even walks onto the stage. The monologue landed. The audience is loose. Everyone's laughing. It's shaping up to be one of those evenings where every joke finds its mark. And then comes our next guest, Jack Lemmon. Now there's a fellow who never needed much introduction. The minute his name is announced, the audience is already applauding before he even appears from behind the curtain. That's the kind of affection people had for Jack. He wasn't just admired, he was genuinely loved. At 55 years old, he was enjoying another remarkable chapter in a career filled with unforgettable performances. Audiences had recently praised his work in The China Syndrome, and now he was preparing to talk about an upcoming comedy. Of course, knowing Jack promoting a movie was usually the least interesting part of the interview. The real entertainment began the moment he sat down. He crossed the stage wearing that familiar smile, shook my hand, waved to the audience, and before either of us had settled into our chairs, the laughter had already started. That's what happened whenever Jack visited. Conversation didn't feel rehearsed. It felt like two old friends picking up where they'd left off. We'd known each other for years, enough years that neither of us worried about where the interview was going. We simply trusted it. Jack launched into one of his impressions. The audience roared. Then came a story about working alongside Billy Wilder. Another roar. Before long, he was describing one of Walter Matthau's habits on a film set, complete with voices, expressions, and exaggerated gestures that had everyone laughing even harder. Even the orchestra was struggling to keep straight faces. I tossed him an easy question. He turned it into another story. I gave him another setup. He knocked it out of the park. That's the wonderful thing about talking with someone whose instincts are every bit as sharp as your own. You stop interviewing. You simply enjoy the ride. For nearly 12 minutes, that's exactly what happened. The room was alive. Laughter rolled across the audience in wave after wave. People leaned forward in their seats because nobody wanted to miss the next story. Everything was unfolding exactly according to plan. Then, something changed. It wasn't dramatic, at least not at first. It was the sort of thing you only notice after spending years talking to thousands of people. Jack's smile lingered just a second too long. Then it faded. His shoulders relaxed. The sparkle that had carried every joke seemed to retreat somewhere deeper. The audience didn't notice. Not immediately, but sitting only a few feet away, I did. Years of interviewing people had taught me to recognize the difference between someone searching for the next punchline and someone searching for the right words. So instead of rushing ahead, I waited. Silence can be uncomfortable on television. Sometimes it's also the most respectful thing you can offer another person. Jack looked down for a brief moment. Then he lifted his eyes. His voice, only moments earlier full of comic energy, had become quiet, almost hesitant. "Johnny?" The room instantly felt different. "I need to tell you something." No laughter followed, no clever remark, just those words. Every person in the studio seemed to sense the shift at exactly the same time. I leaned forward, not as a television host, as a friend. "Of course," I said softly. "Take your time." Jack nodded once. He glanced toward the audience, then toward one of the cameras. Finally, his eyes returned to mine. "I think it's important that people hear this." No one moved. The audience that had been laughing only moments before now sat in complete silence. Sometimes a room full of people can become so quiet you begin noticing things you've ignored all evening. The hum of the studio lights, the distant sound of a camera changing position, someone quietly clearing their throat somewhere in the back row. Everything else simply disappeared. Jack drew a slow breath. "You spend your whole life believing tomorrow will probably look a lot like today," he began. Most of us do. We make plans. We think about next month, next year, the next picture, the next vacation, the next birthday, and then one ordinary day reminds you how precious ordinary days really are? He paused. No one interrupted. I went to see my doctor. It wasn't supposed to be anything serious. Just one of those appointments people make because they think they're getting older. A few audience members exchanged worried looks. Jack continued speaking calmly, almost gently. I'd been feeling tired. There were aches I couldn't quite explain. I convinced myself it was nothing. He offered the smallest smile. I suppose that's what most people do. I nodded quietly. So I went in expecting reassurance. Instead, I walked out carrying news I never expected to hear. He looked directly at me, then back toward the audience. My doctor told me I have cancer. The words hung in the air. Nobody gasped, nobody whispered. Shock has a strange way of silencing an entire room. For a moment, even the cameras seemed frozen. I looked at my friend sitting only a few feet away. The smile that audiences had loved for decades was still there, but now it carried something heavier, something profoundly human. Without thinking, I stood up from behind the desk, crossed the short distance between us, and rested my hand gently on his shoulder. Sometimes words aren't enough. Sometimes presence says everything. I looked at him for a long moment, then quietly said, "Thank you for trusting us." The audience answered not with applause, but with complete silence, the kind of silence reserved for moments people know they'll remember forever. And sitting there beneath the bright studio lights, I realized this interview had become something entirely different. The show was still on the air, but entertainment had quietly stepped aside, making room for something much more important. The audience remained perfectly still. In all my years sitting behind that desk, I'd heard every kind of confession imaginable. Careers had been launched, marriages announced, friendships celebrated. Sometimes even rivalries were settled under those studio lights. But this felt different. The room no longer felt like a television studio. It felt like a living room where millions of people had quietly gathered together. I eased back into my chair, never taking my eyes off Jack. "Would you like to tell us more?" I asked gently. "Only if you're comfortable." Jack nodded. "I think I should." He folded his hands together for a moment before speaking again. "Last Tuesday, I went in expecting a routine checkup." He smiled faintly. "I figured the aches were just another reminder that 55 isn't 25. A few soft chuckles drifted through the audience, exactly the kind of warm laughter that comes from affection rather than comedy. "But after the tests, the doctor came back with news neither of us expected." He paused. "They told me it was colon cancer." The words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. "They also told me they believed they'd found it early." For the first time since the conversation began, there was the smallest sense of relief moving through the audience. "The surgery is scheduled for next Monday," Jack continued. "They'll remove the tumor and examine the surrounding tissue. Right now, the doctors are hopeful." He looked toward me. "They can't make promises. I suppose medicine rarely does." I nodded slowly. "No," I replied. "It doesn't." There was another quiet pause. Then I asked the question many people watching at home were probably asking themselves, "Are you frightened?" Jack didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his hands before letting out a slow breath. "Terrified." The honesty in that single word filled the studio. "I've spent my career pretending to be other people. I've played men facing impossible situations. They always seem to know what to do." He smiled weakly. "Real life doesn't hand you a script." The audience listened without moving. "I have a family. I have friends. I still have stories I want to tell. I'm simply not ready to say goodbye." I leaned forward. "Then don't." Jack looked up. "I've known you a long time. I've watched you fight through difficult roles. I've watched you work harder than almost anyone in this business. And I know one thing. You're not walking into this alone." His eyes glistened. "If you need someone to sit with you, if you need someone to distract you, if you need somebody to answer the telephone at 3 a.m, I'm here. You won't have to ask twice." The audience responded with gentle applause. Not loud, not celebratory, just heartfelt. Jack smiled. Thank you. Before either of us spoke again, something unexpected happened. A woman, seated several rows back, slowly stood. She looked nervous. I'm sorry, she called out softly. I don't mean to interrupt. Security instinctively glanced toward her, but I lifted a hand. It's all right, I said. Go ahead. She swallowed hard. My husband was diagnosed with cancer 6 months ago. Her voice trembled. He won't talk about it. He pretends he's fine. He won't even tell our children how scared he is. She looked directly at Jack. How did you find the courage to tell everyone? The studio became silent again. Jack looked at her with remarkable kindness. I almost didn't, he answered honestly. For several days, I kept everything to myself. I convinced myself I had to appear strong. I smiled. I carried on. I acted as though nothing had changed. Then he shook his head. But keeping the secret became almost harder than hearing the diagnosis. He glanced around the audience. Fear grows in silence. The more alone you are, the louder it becomes. I realized I couldn't carry it by myself. So I stopped trying. The woman quietly wiped away a tear. So tell your husband this for me. He doesn't have to be brave every minute. He just has to let people love him. Many audience members lowered their heads. Others reached for tissues. At that point, I looked toward the control booth where Fred de Cordova was watching. He understood immediately. The interview wasn't ending. The clock no longer mattered. I turned back toward the audience. May I ask everyone something? Several people nodded. If cancer has touched your life, if you've experienced it yourself, or someone you love has, would you mind raising your hand? For a brief second, nothing happened. Then one hand rose, another, 5 more. Soon, nearly a quarter of the audience had their hands in the air. Jack slowly looked around the studio. His expression changed completely. I had no idea, he whispered. An older gentleman stood first. I survived prostate cancer. The audience applauded warmly. A young woman shared that she had recently lost her mother after battling breast cancer. A teenage girl asked how she could encourage her father through chemotherapy without making him feel helpless. Jack answered every question carefully. Sometimes he smiled, sometimes emotion interrupted his words, but he never rushed, neither did anyone else. For nearly 15 minutes, The Tonight Show became something entirely unexpected. Not a comedy program, not a celebrity interview, just people talking honestly, listening honestly, helping complete strangers feel a little less alone. At one point, Jack looked around the room and quietly said, "You know what strikes me? Cancer doesn't care who you are. It doesn't care whether you're famous. It doesn't care whether anyone recognizes your face. It treats everyone exactly the same." He paused. As frightening as that is, it also means none of us has to face it alone. A gentle round of applause filled the studio. As the conversation slowly drew toward its close, I looked back at my old friend. "I want to make you a promise." He smiled. "I'm listening. I'm going to check on you every week. Not because I host a television program, but because you're my friend. And when you're ready, when you've beaten this, I expect to see you sitting in this chair again." Jack laughed softly through moist eyes. "It's a deal." Then he reached across and squeezed my hand. "And thank you for reminding people tonight that asking for help isn't weakness." "It never was," I smiled. "No, it's what friends are for." The audience rose together, not because anyone had asked them to, but because some moments deserve nothing less. And as the applause echoed through Studio One, it was clear to everyone there that the evening had become about far more than television. It had become about hope. The applause continued for what felt like forever. Not the kind of applause performers hope for after a great joke. This was different. It was the sound quieter, more heartfelt. It was the sound of hundreds of people standing together because they had just witnessed something profoundly human. As the cameras finally stopped rolling that evening, very few people in the studio hurried toward the exits. Audience members remained in their seats. Some embraced complete strangers. Others quietly wiped away tears. Backstage, the atmosphere was unlike anything the production staff had experienced before. No one was talking about ratings. No one was discussing tomorrow's show. The only conversation anyone seemed interested in was the one that had just taken place. Within minutes, NBC's switchboard began lighting up. Calls poured in from across the country. They weren't complaints. They weren't requests for autographs. They weren't questions about upcoming guests. People simply wanted to share their own stories. Some thanked Jack for speaking honestly. Others admitted they had been hiding their own diagnosis from family members. Parents called, children called, cancer survivors called, families currently sitting beside loved ones in hospitals called. Many said exactly the same thing. For the first time, we don't feel alone. Over the following days, organizations dedicated to supporting people affected by cancer reported an increase in calls from individuals seeking information, encouragement, and medical guidance. People who had delayed routine checkups began making appointments. Families who had avoided difficult conversations finally sat down together. Doctors later reflected that public conversations encouraging people to seek medical advice and early evaluation could make a meaningful difference in outcomes. Sometimes awareness begins with nothing more complicated than one honest conversation. Behind the scenes, the friendship between Jack and me became even stronger. A promise made under studio lights remained a promise after the cameras were gone. We spoke regularly. Some weeks it was a long conversation. Other weeks it was only a quick phone call asking one simple question. How are you doing today? Sometimes that's the most important question one friend can ask another. Following his surgery, I visited him whenever he felt up to company. We talked about movies, baseball, old comedians, anything except hospitals. For a little while, we tried to make the room feel less like a place for patients and more like a place where two old friends happened to be spending an afternoon together. Laughter, even quiet laughter, has a remarkable way of making difficult days feel just a little shorter. Months passed. Recovery wasn't easy. There were good days, there were difficult days, there were moments of confidence followed by moments of uncertainty. But Jack kept moving forward one step at a time. Then came March of 1981. The audience that evening had no idea what was about to happen. When I looked toward the curtain, I couldn't help smiling. Ladies and gentlemen, I said, please welcome back our good friend, Jack Lemmon. The audience was on its feet before he appeared. The standing ovation seemed endless. Jack walked onto the stage looking noticeably thinner than before, but there was something wonderfully familiar about him. That smile, the same smile everyone had missed. Before either of us sat down, we embraced. No words were necessary. The audience understood. Finally, after the applause settled, I looked across the desk and smiled. Well, you kept your promise, Jack laughed. I told you I'd be back. Then, with the honesty that had defined our previous conversation, he added, I'll admit there were moments when I wasn't certain I would. The room grew quiet once again. What carried you through those moments? I asked. He thought carefully before answering. You know, I kept thinking about that night. The conversation we shared. I remembered everyone watching. I remembered every letter that followed. And I realized I wasn't fighting by myself anymore. He explained that thousands of letters had arrived at his home. Some came from people undergoing treatment. Others came from families supporting loved ones. Many came from survivors who simply wanted to say, I've been where you are. Every letter reminded him of something important. No one fights alone, not if they're willing to let others walk beside them. Years passed. Jack continued working. He continued making audiences laugh. He continued reminding everyone why he had become one of Hollywood's most respected actors. Life moved forward, as life always does. Looking back, it became clear that one evening on television had accomplished something no producer could have planned. It encouraged people to speak openly about fear. It reminded families that difficult conversations are often the ones worth having. And perhaps most importantly, it demonstrated that vulnerability and courage can exist in exactly the same moment. People sometimes ask what makes live television special. They imagine it's the celebrities, the bright lights, the applause, the famous desk, the cameras. Truthfully, none of those things are what people remember most. They remember honesty. They remember kindness. They remember the moments when someone chooses authenticity over performance. Those moments stay with us long after the studio lights have gone dark. If there was one lesson that evening offered everyone watching, it was a simple one. No diagnosis should be faced in silence. No family should carry fear alone. No friend should ever wonder whether reaching out will matter. Sometimes the greatest gift we can offer another person isn't advice. It isn't a perfect speech. It isn't knowing all the answers. Sometimes it's simply sitting beside them and saying, "I'm here." Because those three words often carry more hope than anything else we could possibly say. And perhaps that's why so many people remembered that remarkable evening. Not because it was dramatic, not because it was famous, but because, for a little while, millions of people stopped watching a television show and simply watched one friend stand beside another. If this story leaves you with anything tonight, let it be this. Take care of yourself. Don't ignore the checkup you've been postponing. Listen when your body tells you something isn't right. And if someone you love is carrying a burden they can no longer carry alone, show up, call them, visit them, sit with them. You don't have to fix everything. You just have to let them know they don't have to face it by themselves. Sometimes friendship doesn't change the diagnosis, but it can change how someone walks through it, and that can make all the difference. Thank you for spending this evening with us. Good night, and take care of one another.